Hi, this is Steven Seiler. I want to thank the International Biathlon Union for asking me to make this presentation on the physiological adaptations that improve endurance performance. It's a huge topic, so I thank you for the invitation, but I don't thank you for the challenge of doing this talk in a fashion that will be understandable in the short amount of time I have. But I'm going to make a good effort here. So I'm going to go straight to sharing my screen with you, and hopefully that will work. And here we go. So, to understand endurance training, we have been studying this for many years, and we kind of use two different approaches. One, use exercising athletes to better understand human physiology. We've brought athletes into various laboratories for 100 years. And then, of course, we use basic human physiology to try to make predictions and understand how training processes work at more of a mechanistic level. And this physiology of endurance framework that I'm going to try to present very quickly for you has emerged over 100 years. So it's just untold researchers, numbers of researchers from different countries, Germany, the United States, Scandinavia in particular. All of these have contributed to this framework that I'm presenting. And already, if we go back, it's about 100 years ago, a guy named Archibald Vivian Hill, A.V. Hill, he looked at the world records for different kinds of performance like running and speed skating, and he saw this kind of curve that is not very dissimilar from what we would see today in terms of its shape and the relationship between the speed of performance and the duration of performance. And here's another example of it. This is from a group of pro cyclists. I work with this team. And so this is 22 professional cyclists, and this is their average power output for distances or durations all the way from 5 seconds to 30 minutes in this case. And so we can see that we often will identify a kind of a duration that we might call sprinting. And then we identify a transitional duration that's from about 60 seconds to this 3 to 5 minute area. It's often termed something middle distance. It's kind of in between. And then out beyond 4 or 5 minutes, we typically think of this as endurance performances. And and the fundamentals of this, if I teach you just a little bit of physiology in a short time, is every muscular contraction of every muscular fiber depends on one molecule, and that is called ATP. So that is the value or the valuta that the body uses to transform energy into movement and various processes. And in the case of muscle, of course, it is this so-called cross bridge cycle that there are millions and millions of these every second that add up to the forces in watts and so forth that we produce running, cycling, and so forth. And this is that molecule, and knocking off that one phosphate releases energy that can be transferred to the muscle fiber. And there's we have this energy system. It's often termed as different systems, but we really have three sources of energy. We have the very most basic, which is just the immediate resource of ATP stored, and there's only a few seconds worth stored in the body for that, and a little bit of a buffer called creatine phosphate that can directly transform and help buffer the ATP. But then very quickly, we depend on other sources. And one that's still very fast, but not quite as fast, is this glycolytic phosphorylation or anaerobic glycolysis, meaning just that oxygen is not required. One of the byproducts of this is pyruvate, another is lactate, which you're familiar with. And then, of course, the big one is so-called oxidative phosphorylation, and it requires oxygen. And then, of course, CO2 is excreted or eliminated from the body in this chemical reaction. So this is really the system. And the most important thing is they're all interconnected. So it's really not three different energy systems. It's one energy system designed to provide the body ATP. And if oxygen is not sufficient, the whole thing shuts down. Okay. So if we look at athletes, if we take runners, we typically see this is that we can identify runners. You can, you go to a track and field competition, you can almost see what event they do based on their body size and characteristics. And it's very typical that we'll see this kind of difference between the endurance athletes and the runners in terms of morphology. They're more muscular sprinters, and body to surface weight is different and so forth. And so then we have this intermediate group that you see a transition where literally in this transition from the 800 to the 1500-meter specialists, you see a pretty marked change in their body characteristics. So already there's almost like this dividing line. And if we look at even more of the metabolics of performance, we can see, this is from a colleague of mine when he was in Australia, that we see that already in this transition from about a 2-minute competition distance to 4 minutes, there's big differences in the metabolic characteristics and the dependency on oxygen or aerobic metabolism. So already at about 3.5, 4 minutes, the training of endurance athletes, or these athletes, will look very similar to the same training that a 10,000-meter runner or a marathoner would do, and less like what an 800-meter specialist would do. And we've talked about this in a recent publication. So now I'm going to just kind of rush through that and go to here. If we want to understand the physiology, you really have to do two things. You have to measure workload accurately, and we have bicycle ergometers and treadmills and so forth for doing that. And then you have to measure the physiological responses, and particularly you want to be able to measure the metabolic responses, measure ventilation, measure the oxygen concentration, the CO2 concentration going into the body and leaving the body. And that's been done for these last 100 years. So we've learned quite a lot. And already about 100 years ago, coming up on an anniversary, was probably the first basic description of the maximum oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, by A.V. Hill. Now, he made some mistakes. He probably thought a little too highly of his 4-liter VO2 max and said that was about as high as it could go. And we know that's not true. But the concept of a maximum oxygen consumption has stood the test of time. And in more recent years, if we go to the 50s and 60s, for example, the laboratory in Stockholm with Olström and Saltine, here we see some of the, it looks rather crude, but the treadmill, the first Monarch bicycle, the devices for measuring oxygen concentration and so forth, the so-called Scholonder apparatus. These are almost like museum pieces, but they tell us about the rich story and history of this process of trying to understand endurance. And now we have more sport-specific methods, tools, big treadmills for skiing, which some of you have used, I'm sure, rowing ergometers and paddling ergometers and cycle ergometers and so forth, that allow us to be more sport-specific. But the basic ingredients are the same. Now, VO2 max, the maximum oxygen consumption, is clearly a necessary but not sufficient component. High VO2 max, we'll see, is associated with high performance and endurance, but it's not enough, but it's the start. And then we have to multiply that times what is often termed fractional utilization. Okay, and this is what we would typically describe as the threshold. What percentage of the maximum oxygen consumption can we maintain for quite a while? And we put that together and we can get the athlete's performance oxygen consumption, or performance VO2. How much oxygen can they utilize at a relative steady state for many minutes? And then if we can connect that to the chassis, to the machinery, meaning that if we can take the metabolics and connect it to movement, then now we're talking about efficiency. How efficient is the athlete in transforming metabolic power into speed or cycling power? And when we know that, then we can make predictions about the average performance velocity. So this is the basic framework, these three components. But there's a fourth one, and that is this so-called anaerobic capacity, which is like that battery in your hybrid car, if you drive a hybrid, which is constantly being partially depleted, but can also be recharged along the way by, in this case, the aerobic system. So there's a connection, and this is in many events, such as many races in biathlon or cycling or so forth, where there are variations in power, there are hills, there are turns that require accelerations, then there will be temporary use of anaerobic capacity, this battery, and then it will be partially recharged on the fly during the downhill. And so the higher the VO2 max, the quicker we can recharge the anaerobic capacity. So they're interconnected. And if we go deeper into the components that drive this, then we can see that various researchers have shown the importance of lots of capillaries, the importance of stroke volume, the maximum heart rate, hemoglobin concentration, aerobic enzymes in the mitochondria, fiber type, and then of course anthropometry, the physical characteristics of the athlete and so forth. And so we get this, it's a different way of showing the same thing, the performance VO2 plus whatever O2 deficit you might incur, for example, in very short events, and then times the mechanical efficiency. Now, I would break the mechanical efficiency down into two parts. One is more the internal aspects of the metabolic efficiency, such as fiber type, where slow twitch fibers are more efficient than fast twitch fibers, for example. But also you have, of course, technical efficiency, which in sports like cross-country skiing is obviously extremely important in transferring metabolic power into movement velocity. Now, what are the trainable components? Okay, this is what we want to get at. Of course, then we can look at all of the components in the movement of oxygen from the environment to the working muscle as potential candidates. The lungs, for example, the heart could be. What about the peripheral circulation, moving the blood to the muscle and different aspects of muscle blood flow and capillaries and so forth? Then, of course, when we get to the muscle, we can measure enzyme concentrations and myoglobin and mitochondria and fiber type, and much of this has been done. And so we have a fairly good understanding of where the bottlenecks are in this system and how and what is more trainable than others. And then the only thing I would do is add the brain, because we know more about central aspects of the driving of these processes, and also fatigue, that there are central kinds of fatigue. And then I would also potentially add something we've kind of in recent years published about called durability, in the sense that it seems that over time, athletes who are competing over very long durations develop some adaptations that, without changes in threshold or VO2 max or efficiency, still seem to show continued ability to maintain their bodies longer during these long events like 6-hour cycling races and so forth. So here's this basic framework. And if we go in and look at VO2 max first and what are the subcomponents, then we already know that, way back in the 60s, initial studies showed that if you wanted to be a good endurance athlete, you needed to have a relatively high VO2 max, either measured in liters per minute or in milliliters per kilogram per minute, somewhat depending on the nature of your competition. And some of these, of course, these absolute amounts are pretty similar to what we would say today. Some of them probably were underestimates because they were based on just a Swedish sample. Here's a more international sample. And when we look at it, the values are somewhat higher, and we can express them as absolute values, such as, around 7 liters for men is about the highest we see. Around 5 liters for female athletes is about the highest we have seen across different labs in different parts of the world. If we look at it as mLs per kg, it's around 90 as an upper limit for men, and about 80, at least in Norway, we've at least had 3 athletes that have been around the 80 mLs per kg mark among our endurance athletes. So how do you get a big VO2 max? Well, you have to think of the heart and the lungs and the circulatory system as kind of this single apparatus for moving oxygen from the air to the tissues and delivering carbon dioxide back. And this was said by Lawrence Henderson already back in 1929. And so one thing we know for sure is that the body cannot use more oxygen than the heart can deliver. So you can make different discussions about what are the limiting factors, but we do know that. And so the heart is critical for moving oxygen from the atmosphere through the lungs, or and what should I say, transferring the oxygen to the blood, enriching the blood with oxygen, and then transferring that blood in the form of red blood cells to the working tissue where mitochondria can use that oxygen. And this process is fundamental. And that heart that's about the size of your fist in elite performers can, depending on body size and so forth, pump anywhere from 20 liters per minute to up to 40 liters of blood per minute, which is just a phenomenal amount of blood moved per minute when you think about the size of the pump. Um, you can turn on your water faucet and measure how much comes out each minute to get an idea of that, how good our hearts pump. So what are the pump components? Well, you have a rate, a frequency of heart rate, of heart pumping, and you have a stroke volume. This would be true in any kind of engine, is there's a frequency and a stroke volume. And then you, in the case of moving oxygen, you have an oxygen concentration in the blood that is being pumped. And when you combine those three components, you get oxygen delivery out to the muscles. And then if we know how much oxygen is still left in the blood when it comes back to the heart after its trip out to the body, then that difference represents the extraction of oxygen. And then what we can do is put some numbers to this. So a young athlete might have a maximum heart rate of 200 beats per minute. They might be able to pump 150 milliliters in each beat of that 200 beats. That's not an extravagant number, but it's a good number. And that would give 30 liters of blood per minute in this example. And then we're going to be interested in knowing, well, how much oxygen is in those liters of blood? And let's say if we had, 15, 16 grams per deciliter hemoglobin, that would translate to about 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood that's being pumped. And then not all of it, but most of it would be extracted during extreme high intensity exercise. And so we would be able to find maybe that about 175 milliliters of oxygen was extracted per liter. So 30 liters times 0.175 liters gives us about 5,000 or 5.25 liters of oxygen per minute. That's that absolute value. And then, of course, depending on the weight of the athlete, that could translate to anything from a 70 mLs per kg VO2 max to over 87 mLs per kg if it was a much smaller athlete. So that's the math. Now, what part of this math is trainable? Well, heart rate is not. Maximum heart rate, for the first thing, varies quite a bit between athletes. It's very individual. So at any given age, you can see big differences in maximum heart rate, and it's not associated with performance. So this athlete with a 210 max heart rate doesn't automatically have better VO2 max than this athlete with 175 maximum heart rate. In general, maximum heart rate slides downward slowly with age, but again, there's variation. And this is from laboratory testing, but even if you just ask people, as we have 4,000 endurance trained athletes, we end up with exactly the same equation as far as a prediction. But you see that if you don't know your max heart rate, it's using an age-related prediction is pretty useless as a tool. But it tells us what we also know is that heart rate is not trainable. Okay. And so it's individual, it's not trainable. It actually declines a little if you start training, and it will slowly decline with age. So heart rate's not really part of the trainable components. Stroke volume, yes. Stroke volume consists of how much blood is in the heart at the end of what's called diastole, or the refilling. And then after the heart contracts, how much is left over? And the difference between those two is what we call the stroke volume. So end diastolic minus end systolic. And these can change. These can be improved with training, particularly the end diastolic volume. We can fill the heart with more blood because the the heart gets bigger for one thing. Stroke in systolic volume, or how much is squeezed out, is pretty consistent. But overall, the heart gets bigger. The heart gets more compliant, meaning it's a little bit, it stretches easier and fills easier with blood. The blood volume in the body actually increases, which it primes the pump better and leads to better blood pumping function of the heart. And so the stroke volume adaptation is both infrastructure, meaning building a bigger heart muscle, but it's also kind of a fresh fruit response in the sense that blood volume is increased, and that can also go back down fairly quickly. For example, if an athlete gets sick for 3 or 4 days with the flu and is laying in bed, their blood volume will actually go down. They'll pee away some volume. And so that's one of the first things that has to come back after a period of sickness. So stroke volume is definitely trainable. And of course, we know that the oxygen concentration in the blood, it's individual. It's, we have ranges that are healthy, and it's to a certain extent trainable, but it's a fresh fruit response because there's a rapid decay of hemoglobin. Red blood cells are constantly kind of dying out. And so if we manage to pump up the amount of red blood cells, but then we leave altitude, then that response decays fairly rapidly. So yes, this is trainable, but it's not it's something you've got to constantly work with to keep it high. And it's very individual. And so these central variables are the stroke volume is trainable. When it comes to the peripheral variables, fiber type, capillary density, mitochondrial adaptations, and so forth, there's a great deal of trainability. So those two big trainable aspects are the stroke volume for cardiac delivery of oxygen, and then utilization of oxygen in an efficient manner that doesn't result in a lot of additional byproducts that inhibit contraction. That takes a lot of training. So here's a picture. If you focus on this right side of upright exercise, which is more typical, as we increase intensity, the volume of the heart increases, and the so-called end diastolic volume increases. The in systolic volume goes down a bit, and that difference is the stroke volume. And with training, we increase the end diastolic volume, and we increase the total stroke volume. And we see that well-trained muscle becomes more compliant. It grows, the volume of the heart grows, the heart grows in proportion, and it's able to fill with blood faster and more completely during diastole. And this happens essentially at all intensities, although there's some arguments to be made for that interval training with high intensity work and a very high degree of filling may top off the tank in terms of increasing that stroke volume performance. What doesn't really change is how that muscle contracts, and the endurance of the heart muscle doesn't change because it's already phenomenal. Our hearts are the ultimate endurance muscle, and that's true from day one. So that's not a trainable aspect of cardiac performance. Now, there are some questions that come up about this issue of VO2 max versus VO2 peak. And this has been going on for many decades. And here we see a study from 1976 in Stockholm. And they looked at a group of 10 athletes that either ran on a treadmill at 5 to 8% incline, or they used arm cycling, which you see here on the right upper corner, or they used cycling with the legs. And then they use various combinations of both legs and arms, which you see here. And what they showed is that number one, running up an incline gave the highest VO2 max. As you might expect, just arm cycling, the athletes were not able to, or the subjects were not able to reach the same VO2, about 70%, and heart rate was a bit lower. Cycling with the legs was close to the same as running, but as we still see today, in general, cycling will give a somewhat lower VO2 peak than we see for running. There's not quite as much muscle activation. So it's usually on average about 7% lower. And if you add in the arms, as you might with skiing, you can get close to that VO2 max with running. But what we don't see is that you don't get 7 liters. You don't add up arms plus legs and get a hugely different value than you do just with the legs. Why? Well, that's because the capacity for muscle to receive oxygen and use it is a lot bigger than the capacity for the heart to deliver that oxygen. And with training, I should say that, when we start exercising, an athlete, well, if we compare rest to activity, during rest, the blood flow is distributed across different places like the kidneys and the liver and the brain, and a little bit's going to muscle, and the heart is using some of its own pump blood flow to oxygenate itself. And then when we start exercising, more and more of the blood flow that is increasing is diverted to the working muscle, and the body actually squeezes down on blood flow to other parts of the body except the brain. The brain's blood flow is defended always, so it always gets its share. But during exercise, the body will temporarily constrict blood flow to, say, the kidneys and the skin and so forth, and try to redirect primarily all the blood flow to the working muscle. And with training, more blood flow is available, and all of that increase gets diverted to the working muscle. Okay. And it's really important here, and Rao showed this, that one of the reasons VO2 max is what it is and cannot be higher is that the body has to defend blood pressure. So you can imagine if you turn on all the faucets at the same time in a house, then the pressure in the water system can get lower. And this is exactly the same in the human body. So the human body says, I have to make sure arterial blood pressure is maintained. I have to get enough blood pressure to push blood up to the brain. So that is a limiting factor for blood flow and VO2 max ultimately. Okay, so here is our system. We've talked about VO2 max. If we go over to this so-called fractional utilization, what we mean is what fraction or percentage of the VO2 max can the athlete use for a relatively long time? And of course, you can get into big arguments about, well, how long is a relatively long time? And I'll just say, well, it can be anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Okay. And there have been many names for the threshold. The first probably was already in 1959, although the name didn't catch on. And the name that really became popular was the anaerobic threshold, which was introduced by Wasserman from the United States in 1964. And you've had many different other names. I prefer these two because they're neutral and because the term anaerobic is absolutely wrong. It's something that's stuck around for decades and decades, but it's physiologically incorrect because it's not something that suddenly metabolism becomes anaerobic above a certain intensity. At any rate, a deer child has many names, and I'm sure you've seen many of these. And when you go into the laboratory, you can either estimate these thresholds using lactate, and here we see the lactate curve with a progressive ramp in intensity, or you can use ventilation characteristics, and you will basically get to the same answer regarding that. You will find that there are two breakpoints that kind of serve to distinguish three intensity zones that are physiologically defensible, to argue that they are there. And then, of course, the upper limit for this third zone in an aerobic sense is the VO2 max. But I won't talk so much more about that. In physiological studies, you'll often see these three zones, and threshold is that area in the middle. And then this is the typical kind of three-zone model we might see. Now, when you have athletes exercising these different intensities, you get something like this as a typical distribution for intensity, the blood flow, and the lactate responses, and so forth. And there's a great deal of trainability in these values, as we know, associated with peripheral adaptations. So this says something about the threshold. And then if we go to efficiency, I won't say a whole lot. There probably are differences depending on sport regarding the trainability of the work efficiency, but there is at least evidence to suggest that efficiency has a long developmental time frame. And this is a classic case study from Paula Radcliffe by Andrew Jones, who he did testing on her fairly consistently over about a 10-year period. Her VO2 max already at a young age was flattened out at about 70 mLs per kg, didn't really change over the years. Her lactate threshold, her velocity at lactate threshold or 2 millimolar lactate steadily improved from about 15 kilometers per hour to about 18, 19 kilometers an hour. So that's about a 25% change across 10 years. But also her running economy improved, meaning she used less oxygen at a given running speed on the treadmill as she continued to increase training volume and as she continued to train. So this is a very reproducible thing we see, is that VO2 max is the first to improve, or the first to plateau, you might say. And I created this little picture very simply already in 1996. So many years ago, way before I had gray hair. And basically, even after 1 or 2 years of highly specific, sport specific training, you might see a plateau in VO2 max. In athletes, lactate threshold takes longer, but say, when we talk to pro cyclists, they'll say their threshold data is not really changing after 4 or 5 years, but they will argue that maybe they become more efficient and they handle loads and are able to go longer. So this is a typical kind of generalizable idea of these various time frames, and VO2 max is the first to plateau. Now, here's an example. This is the 3 athletes or 3 runners that have ever gone below 3:30, 7:30, and 13 minutes in the 1500, 3000, and 5000 respectively are these 3: Saeed Oida, Daniel Coleman, and Jakob Ingebrigtsen from Norway, who's a current star. 2 of those 3 who did these remarkable performances, this world record still stands. They achieved almost all of this already by the time they were 21 years old. Oida was more traditional. He reached his peak performance at what we would have typically described as the age of peak performance for endurance, but already these were doing so at a very young age. And the difference up to the world record, for example, for Ingebrigtsen is only about 1 to 1.5% for these 3 distances. But will he get there? Well, if we look at his progression, we see that from 14 to 18, he had a 14% improvement in his 1500-meter personal best. From 18 to 21, the improvement was only 1.4%. So already we can see that this highly successful athlete is on the, you might say, the plateau of his performance curve. And it will be a question of whether he's able to generate an additional 1.4% improvement that would bring him down to around world record level. Here's a world champion in cycling, a junior world champion from Sandnes. And here you see his power duration curve at age 14 and up to age 18. And you see that across the curve from 10 seconds to 60 minutes, it's a slow progression up. So at all distances, the training, which is mostly an increase in volume, is leading to an increase in power across a spectrum of durations. And of course, his success in professional cycling will depend on him being able to extend this out over 4 or 5 hours in cycling, professional cycling competitions. And last, I'll just say that, what we know is these basic time courses of adaptation are true, but if mistakes are made in the training, and I think this is one of the greatest or best case studies, when mistakes are made, it can result in the need to completely revamp the training, and that can have an impact on the time course of adaptations and on the time course of an athlete's peak performance, and reaching peak performance. And so we have to keep that in mind. And there are examples of athletes that have changed their training and achieved big success some years after what should have been, or what we would have expected to be, their age of peak performance. So with that, I will say thank you very much. And questions will be answered, as far as I understand, by Professor Øyvind Sandbakk. Good luck with the rest of your conference. Thank you.